Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're taking a deep dive into a relationship that, well, it's perplexed global politics for decades. The enduring complex hostility between the United States and Iran. Now, a lot of common takes out there, they tend to simplify this, reduce it to easy labels like Islamic fundamentalism.
hmm
But our source material for this deep dive, it's a detailed academic paper, suggests a much deeper and frankly more surprising story. Traditional political science often expects nations to act purely on their strategic interests, using what's called a rational actor model, where every decision is a calculated move. But you're suggesting that simply doesn't hold up here.
Exactly. Yeah, our mission today is really to explore why. Why has this animosity persisted for so long? What's fascinating here and what the paper really highlights is that the rational actor model, it just doesn't fully explain the enduring U.S.-Iranian hostility. It falls short. Instead, we're kind of left looking at the realm of psychological and emotional aspects, factors at play in both states, which seem to add, well, undue weight to the impact of recent historical events.
Okay, so to really understand this dynamic, how does our source actually define long-term hostility in this specific, often baffling context? What are the layers we need to peel back?
Right. Well, our source defines it as a protracted conflict between two parties. It's short of outright war, but it has four distinct components. First, there's the diplomatic aspect. That covers everything from formal relations, or lack thereof, to informal bilateral exchanges, multilateral diplomacy, basically whether they're even talking to each other and how.
And that's often been a freeze, hasn't it? Just silence.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
A deep freeze for long periods.
Mm.
Then, the economic component. This is largely defined by U.S. economic sanctions, things like the Iran and Libya Sanctions Act of 1996, for instance. And this wasn't just about general trade, it was strategically aimed at crippling Iran's oil and gas revenues. The belief was those revenues funded weapons of mass destruction programs and international terrorist groups. Plus, you have the nationalization of U.S. property in Iran. These sanctions have been a constant, a real defining feature for so long.
Clearly a huge point of contention, a constant source of friction.
Indeed. Then a crucial third component is the political. This centers on how domestic politics and various interest groups, and this is key, in both countries actively influence their foreign policy towards each other.
Ah, so it's not just external calculations, it's internal pressures too.
Exactly. And finally, the military component. This is quite broad. It includes conventional military confrontations, the significant U.S. forward deployment in the Persian Gulf, Iran's WMD programs or suspected programs, and also Iran's direct or indirect involvement in international terrorism. The paper mentions examples like um, a German court ruling linking Iran to assassinations, the whole Salman Rushdie affair, and later the targeting of the Mujahideen Khalq.
Which is that controversial Iranian opposition group, right?
Sorry.
Started as an armed movement.
That's the one. So yeah, it covers a lot of ground.
That paints a very clear, multifaceted picture of the sheer breadth of this conflict. It's not just one thing. But here's the central puzzle, isn't it? Despite Ayatollah Khomeini's passing back in 1989, U.S.-Iranian relations remained virtually frozen for decades. It makes you wonder, why does the United States, arguably the world's most powerful country, seem to have several permanent enemies? Is this relationship truly unique in its enduring animosity?
That's a really compelling question,
Yeah.
especially when you think about that famous quote, Lord Palmerston's quote, about England having no permanent friends, only permanent interests. But our source makes a powerful argument here. It suggests the U.S.-Iran relationship isn't actually an exceptional case for the United States at all. It fits a pattern.
That's a crucial observation. So it's not an outlier. What historical parallels does the paper draw to support this idea?
Well, the paper elaborates on this recurring historical pattern, a pattern of protracted antagonism in U.S. diplomacy throughout the 20th century. Essentially, the U.S. had, well, a remarkable difficulty accepting historical shifts it deemed undesirable. It simply took a very long time to formally acknowledge what had already happened on the ground.
Like refusing to accept the new reality.
Pretty much. Think about it. The U.S. refused to recognize the Soviet Union for 16 years. 16 years. That effectively laid some of the groundwork for the Cold War. Diplomatic relations with Cuba, broken off in early 1960 and not reestablished for decades and decades.
And China, too, right? I mean, the People's Republic was founded in 1949, but the U.S. didn't establish diplomatic relations until 1972, even after an undeclared war in Korea.
Exactly. A huge gap there.
Mhm.
And with Vietnam, even though a peace accord was reached in 1973, diplomatic relations with a united Vietnam weren't established until 1995. That's over 2 decades after the war ended.
Wow, that's a striking pattern when you lay it out like that. It's quite consistent. So our source suggests this isn't just coincidence, but it reveals a fundamental institutional tendency in U.S. foreign policy, a kind of profound resistance to accepting geopolitical shifts it perceives as undesirable. It's almost as if some outcomes are simply too unpalatable to ever be officially acknowledged, even long after the fact.
That seems to be the argument. It points to a certain, maybe, exceptionalism in U.S. foreign policy, a long-held belief in its ability, or perhaps its right, to dictate outcomes. And to fully grasp Iran's role in this, we also need to delve into its own deep history.
Right, because it's a two-way street.
Absolutely. Iran has repeatedly found itself in protracted conflicts with major powers. It's suffered foreign dominance for long stretches. The 19th century, for instance, saw immense external pressure. Russia pressing down from the north, the British colonial empire in India pushing from the east. And this culminated in that 1907 treaty, the one that just divided Iran into spheres of interest between Russia and Britain without any Iranian consultation.
Imagine that, just carved up on a map by outsiders. That's a profound psychological blow right there, to be treated like an object, not a sovereign nation.
Absolutely. A deep historical wound. And this historical memory is crucial because for many Iranians, the overwhelming U.S. presence in Iran after World War II, it wasn't seen as liberation or modernization necessarily. It was perceived as just another foreign intrusion, another chapter in a long story of outside interference, even if the U.S. saw its own role very differently.
And we can trace that specific U.S. involvement from its early stages. In the early 20th century, Iran actually sought U.S. administrative and economic help, but U.S. businessmen, they struggled against those entrenched British oil interests, right?
Yeah, the British were deeply dug in. Then during World War II, the U.S. actually helped Britain and the Soviet Union occupy Iran. The aim was to counter German influence.
An occupation, even if for strategic reasons against the Nazis.
Yes. And then, post-WWII, the U.S. was instrumental in compelling Stalin to withdraw Soviet troops from northern Iran in 1946, a major moment. And then the U.S. gained major influence through military and economic agreements with the Shah.
Leading up to that pivotal scarring moment in 1953.
Exactly, 1953. The CIA and British intelligence, MI6, initiated the overthrow of the elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh. This wasn't just a political event for many Iranians. It crystallized a deep-seated suspicion, a belief that external powers, especially the US and UK, would always undermine their sovereignty if it suited them. It became this powerful emotional scar, a symbol.
Which was then followed by massive U.S. economic and military aid to Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, the restored monarch, throughout the 50s and 60s.
Huge amounts of aid, yes, bolstering the Shah's regime.
And by the 1970s, Iran had really become a key regional ally, a sort of strongman for the U.S. in the Gulf, the policeman of the Gulf.
That was the idea, under the Nixon Doctrine, and then boom, 1979 hit. The Iranian Revolution swept away the Shah, and almost simultaneously, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan happened next door. These two events led to the direct collision, the deep freeze we're still discussing today.
Wow. So the seeds were sown over decades, really.
Decades. And this complex history continues to shape contrasting perceptions even today. It's not just history, it's alive now. Take Iran's military buildup, for example. The U.S. sees it as destabilizing, aggressive, aimed at acquiring nuclear weapons.
That's the standard view in Washington.
Right. But Iran, from Tehran's perspective, they see it as necessary self-defense. Look at their neighborhood, they'd say. They've faced 3 major wars nearby in just 2 decades. The brutal Iran-Iraq War, the first Gulf War, the war in Afghanistan. Plus, you've got a nuclear buildup happening between Pakistan and India right next door. And smaller, but still serious regional conflicts on its periphery. Think Tajikistan, Nagorno-Karabakh, Chechnya back then. So they feel surrounded.
Yes. So Iran sees its military posture as purely defensive, given the instability all around, while the U.S. sees that same posture as inherently aggressive and threatening.
Precisely. 2 completely different lenses viewing the same actions. It happens again with Hezbollah. The U.S. officially designates Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. Full stop. But Tehran, they consider them legitimate resistance fighters, freedom fighters, worthy of Iranian support.
Again, diametrically opposed views.
And regarding the Middle East peace process, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the U.S. is often infuriated by Iran's staunch opposition, its funding of groups opposed to peace deals. But from the Iranian perspective, they feel their country has a sovereign right to his opinion and his actions regarding a highly contested issue in their region. They don't feel obligated to follow the U.S. line.
It's truly baffling, though, isn't it, that despite all this deep hostility, these clashing views, Our source points to instances where Iran and the U.S. actually had shared interests. You mentioned Afghanistan, dealing with the Taliban initially, Yugoslavia, fighting international drug trafficking. There were areas of potential cooperation. How does the paper explain why these common grounds are so consistently overlooked or just flat out denied by both sides? Why couldn't they build on those?
It's a critical point and a frustrating one. The paper suggests this denial, this inability to acknowledge common ground, stems from that profound emotional and ideological baggage we talked about. For leaders on both sides, acknowledging common interests could seem like a betrayal of core national narratives, of historical grievances. It becomes politically toxic.
So the story each side tells itself becomes more important than the potential pragmatic benefits of cooperation.
In many ways, yes. The narrative takes precedence.
All of this history, these patterns of behavior, these clashing perceptions, it really makes you wonder if our conventional ways of analyzing international relations are even adequate here. Our source argues that the traditional realist paradigm, focused purely on power balances and national interests, falls short in explaining the US-Iran situation. What exactly is it missing? What doesn't realism capture in this complex dynamic?
Well, realism, at its core, assumes rational action, a rational cost-benefit analysis, where every state acts logically in its own perceived best interest to maximize power or security. But our source argues this simply hasn't been the whole story for U.S.-Iran relations. The level of hostility seems disproportionate to purely objective threats or conflicts of interest. Now, while Iran's foreign policy after Khomeini passed away has arguably shown pragmatic streaks in some areas, what you might call realpolitik, right? Focusing on practical gains over pure ideology, like their relations with Russia or how they try to balance power dynamics in the Caucasus region, that looks somewhat rational.
Okay, so there are elements of that.
Yes, but then you have other aspects. Its state-sponsored terrorism, its deeply entrenched anti-Israel stance. Those certainly seem to contradict a purely rational, interest-based calculation that carries significant costs internationally.
So, if it's not just rational self interest driving things, where else should we look? We've talked about how Iran's internal drivers, historical memory, revolutionary ideology shaped its foreign policy. But what about the U.S. side? Does our source suggest that American domestic pressures, specific lobby groups perhaps, played a significant, maybe even an outsized role in shaping its sometimes very uncompromising stance towards Iran?
Absolutely. The paper stresses this point heavily. Since World War I, really, diplomacy has increasingly become aimed at pleasing domestic audiences, domestic constituencies. This makes foreign policy inextricably linked to internal affairs. It's not just nation to nation. It's about politics back home.
Selling the policy domestically.
Exactly. And this applies directly to Iran. Think about the early Islamic Republic, its aggressive diplomacy, the inflammatory rhetoric, actions like the embassy seizure. The paper argues these were largely aimed at consolidating power domestically, at firing up a domestic audience, even though they isolated Iran internationally. Huge costs, but maybe necessary for regime survival at the time. And even today, despite signs that the Iranian public might be weary of isolationism, that hardline anti-American rhetoric persists. Why? Because the ruling clergy often feels it needs that ideological antagonism for legitimacy, for its own survival.
And crucially, turning the lens back on the U.S., the source highlights that U.S. containment policy towards Iran wasn't just a response to external threats either. It was also strongly influenced by U.S. domestic politics and lobby groups.
That's a really powerful and often overlooked argument in the paper. It contends that U.S. policy actually became more uncompromising at certain points. For example, the Clinton administration's Iran and Libya Sanctions Act in 1996. This happened even when the perceived immediate threat from Iran had arguably subsided somewhat compared to the early post-revolution years. Why? The source suggests it was largely due to domestic political dynamics and ideological entrapment. The political costs inside the U.S. of appearing soft on Iran often outweighed any purely rational reevaluation of the actual threat or potential benefits of engagement.
Wow, so internal political needs on both sides can actually override what might seem like a rational foreign policy shift based on changing circumstances. That's quite something. The paper also touches on deterrence and containment theories. These were obviously central to the Cold War. While the U.S. clearly modeled its approach to Iran on its Cold War experience with the Soviets, the source argues that this model often fails. It fails to account for how perceived threats, sometimes inflated perceptions, can end up determining what a nation sees as its interest rather than the other way around. And that dual containment, the policy towards Iran and Iraq in the 90s, itself lost sight of its objectives.
Yes, exactly. Dual containment, the strategy of trying to isolate and weaken both Iran and Iraq simultaneously, was initially presented as a rational way to manage two problematic states. But the paper argues it ultimately became rigid, an end in itself. It perhaps failed to adapt to changing realities or consider whether containing both so harshly was actually counterproductive in the long run. It lost sight of its objectives. And here's another maybe surprising insight from the source regarding the Iranian Revolution itself.
Okay.
It argues we shouldn't view it merely as Islamic fundamentalism, in the way that term is often understood in the West, purely religious, maybe monolithic. Instead, the paper frames it as a populist, anti-imperialist social revolution. A complex mix, really. A product of Shiite Islamic traditions, yes, but also Marxist ideas and potent Iranian nationalist sentiments all woven together.
That's a fascinating reframing. So it wasn't just a religious uprising overthrowing a secular king. It was much more layered.
Much more layered, according to this analysis. Not just a simple clash of civilizations. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the source makes a provocative point. Iran is, theoretically, perhaps a secular country, in the specific sense that the state ultimately defines the clergy's place in power within the political system, not the other way around. Now, that's a complex argument, but it offers a very different lens than the simple theocracy versus the West narrative. It suggests the conflict runs deeper and is structured differently than just simple religious differences.
Okay, this next point, I think, truly reframes how we look at the whole thing. Because the source's main theoretical argument, the real crux of its analysis, is that the longevity of this conflict, the reason it's lasted so long, is primarily caused by entrenched emotional issues rather than purely substantive conflicts of interest. This is where it gets really interesting. Let's look at the actual disconnect.
Yeah, this is central to the paper's thesis. To illustrate this disconnect, the source lays out this compelling table, basically. It categorizes the conflicting issues into substantive, like policy disputes, concrete actions, and emotional feelings, perceptions, historical grievances from both sides' perspectives. So, from Iran's perspective, the emotional issues are deep-seated. Things like U.S. involvement in the 1953 coup, that's huge. U.S. support for the Shah's autocratic regime for decades after that. A perception of cynical exploitation that the U.S. just used Iran for its own self-interest, particularly oil. Unconditional U.S. support for Israel, seen as inherently anti-Iranian or anti-Muslim, and a general feeling of U.S. disrespect for Iranian cultural and religious values.
Okay, those are powerful historical and perceptual grievances. What about the substantive ones from Iran's view? Things the U.S. did.
Right, the concrete actions. The substantive issues from Iran's perspective regarding U.S. actions include those pervasive U.S. sanctions on trade, aid, and crucially, arms sales. Billions in frozen Iranian financial assets held in the U.S. since the revolution. Direct U.S.-Iranian naval confrontations in the Persian Gulf during the Iran-Iraq War in 1987-1988, the tragic downing of an Iranian civilian A-300 Airbus by the USS Vincennes in 1988, killing 290 people, and U.S. indirect support for Saddam Hussein's Iraq during the brutal 8-year Iran-Iraq War.
Okay, a significant list on both emotional and substantive grounds from the Iranian side. Now, flip it. What about from the U.S. perspective? What are their grievances, both emotional and substantive?
From the U.S. perspective, the emotional issues listed are also quite potent. There's a perception of Iranian lack of appreciation or ingratitude for past U.S. political, economic, and military support, especially against perceived Soviet aggression during the Cold War. Iran's profound disrespect for American national values, epitomized by the Great Satan rhetoric. The extreme national humiliation felt in the U.S. during the hostage crisis from 1979 to 1981, which dominated headlines for 444 days. And a feeling that Iran consistently blames the United States for what are arguably Iran's own domestic problems or failings.
And the substantive issues. What actions by Iran does the U.S. point to?
On the substantive side, from the U.S. perspective regarding Iran's actions, the taking of U.S. hostages in Lebanon by groups linked to Iran, and the devastating bombing of the U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut in 1983. Iran's pursuit of WMD programs, particularly nuclear capabilities. The Khobar Towers bombing in Saudi Arabia in 1996, which killed U.S. servicemen and was attributed to Iranian-backed militants. And as mentioned before, Iran's active opposition to the U.S.-led Middle East peace process.
Wow. When you lay them out side by side like that, the lists are long on both sides. But the source's argument is that the emotional weight is disproportionate. It suggests that both nations are perhaps more caught in this feedback loop of historical pain, perceived disrespect, national humiliation, more than they are locked in actual, fundamentally irreconcilable policy differences that couldn't theoretically be negotiated. That's a truly uncomfortable but potentially insightful truth.
It is uncomfortable, and that's precisely the argument. The source contends that the substantive issues, while serious, simply do not fully measure up to the sheer intensity and duration of the observed hostility. Therefore, the paper concludes, the primary causal explanation, perhaps the key to any potential solution, must be found primarily in these deeply ingrained psychological and emotional issues on both sides.
And this feeds directly into things like misperception and misunderstanding, right? Driven by collective needs, national fears, historical narratives, not just cool, rational calculation. The paper mentions the mirror image effect, how Iranian great Satan rhetoric negatively shapes U.S. perceptions, and perhaps vice versa. But it also talks about what it calls the Iranian cult of conspiracy theories, like the genuinely held belief by many Iranians, apparently, that Ayatollah Khamenei himself was deliberately installed or somehow created by the U.S. or Britain to destabilize the region for their own ends. How deeply do these kinds of, frankly, irrational beliefs entrench the conflict?
They entrench it profoundly, because they essentially bypass rational discourse altogether. If every misfortune is potentially viewed as part of a hidden foreign plot, or if every perceived slight from the other side is magnified tenfold through the lens of past humiliation and suspicion, it becomes incredibly difficult to build trust or find common ground based on facts. Ultimately, the source concludes with this really powerful idea. The conflict between the United States and Iran is as much inside people's heads as it is an external and tangible phenomenon out there in the world.
That's a powerful and deeply insightful conclusion. Inside people's heads.
Yeah.
Okay. If the conflict is truly inside people's heads, as the source puts it, how does a diplomat even begin to negotiate that? Is it less about policy papers and position statements and more like, well, like a very complex form of global therapy almost?
It almost feels that way sometimes, doesn't it? When I first encountered this framing in the paper, the sharp distinction between the substantive and the emotional drivers, it really did reframe how I personally viewed decades of this standoff. It's an uncomfortable realization, perhaps, but also a powerful one. It suggests that lasting resolution demands a fundamentally different approach, one that acknowledges and somehow addresses these deep emotional currents.
This deep dive has truly shown us, based on our source, that the long-standing U.S.-Iran hostility seems rooted far more in these deep-seated psychological and emotional factors than we might assume. Historical grievances, perceptions of humiliation, national identity issues, maybe weighing even more heavily than purely rational conflicts of interest.
And understanding these non-rational aspects, as our source highlights, is just crucial, not only for crafting more effective future policy, but also for any hope of truly cracking that thick wall of mistrust that exists between the two nations. It suggests perhaps that the solutions lie not just in new treaties or different sanctions regimes, but somehow in addressing old wounds, acknowledging past pains, changing perceptions. Much harder to do, of course.
Much harder, absolutely. So, a final thought for you, our listener, to ponder. When you consider how much history, emotion, and perception seem to shape the specific, enduring animosity between the U.S. and Iran, what similar unseen forces, these psychological undercurrents, might be at play in other long-standing international conflicts you observe around the world? Is it possible that many protracted disputes are actually about feelings about dignity, respect, historical memory, just as much as, or maybe even more than, they are about tangible things like territory or resources? Something to think about. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.